The biggest mistakes rarely begin with bad decisions. They begin with ordinary moments that look completely harmless. Rain poured over Midtown Manhattan with the stubborn rhythm of a city that never slowed down, turning yellow traffic lights into blurred streaks across wet pavement and covering every passing engine with a soft metallic hiss. Grace Morgan hurried beneath a fading blue umbrella that had already surrendered to the weather, cold water slipping down the sleeves of her dark jacket as she checked the time glowing on her cracked phone screen. 11:42 p.m. Her shift at the luxury hotel had ended almost 40 minutes late after a wedding reception refused to end on schedule, and now the subway station 2 blocks away had announced another delay. The rideshare app spun endlessly before flashing the message every exhausted New Yorker hated seeing. High demand, longer wait times, she sighed, tucked a loose strand of damp blonde hair behind her ear and rubbed her hands together against the chilly October air. Rent was due in 4 days. Her student loan payment was due in 6. Every extra dollar mattered. Surge pricing did not. A pair of headlights appeared through the curtain of rain, gliding toward the curb with calm precision. A black SUV slowed almost exactly where she stood. It was spotless despite the weather, its polished body reflecting the city lights like dark glass. Grace lifted one hand without thinking. Finally, she muttered under her breath. The SUV stopped. The passenger window lowered only halfway. Inside sat a man wearing a charcoal overcoat over a perfectly tailored black suit. He looked somewhere in his early 30s, his dark hair neatly combed back, his expression unreadable beneath the soft glow of the dashboard. He didn't look annoyed. He didn't look welcoming either. He simply watched her with the quiet patience of someone who never rushed for anyone. "You called for a ride?" Grace asked, already reaching for the rear door handle. The man glanced briefly toward the rain-soaked street before returning his eyes to her. "Get in," he answered calmly. That was enough for Grace. She climbed inside without another question, grateful for the warmth that immediately wrapped around her frozen hands. The leather seats smelled faintly of cedar and expensive cologne instead of the coffee cups and fast food wrappers she expected from late-night drivers. The cabin was silent except for the gentle tapping of rain against tinted windows. She pulled the seat belt across her chest and laughed quietly. "Rough night?" she asked while brushing water from her sleeves. "You don't look thrilled to be working this late." The driver rested both hands lightly on the steering wheel before easing back into traffic. "Something like that." His voice was steady, controlled, not unfriendly. "Just careful." Grace smiled politely, assuming he was one more New Yorker surviving another impossible workday. "I get it. Hospitality isn't exactly glamorous after midnight." He gave the smallest nod but offered nothing else. Outside, Times Square disappeared behind sheets of rain while the SUV continued downtown with surprising confidence, weaving through traffic without relying on GPS. Grace frowned slightly and looked toward the center console. No rideshare phone, no navigation screen, no company logo. She looked again at the dashboard, then at the man driving. "You know," she said carefully, "you're either the most prepared driver in Manhattan or you're incredibly good at pretending." A faint smile almost appeared before disappearing again. "I've driven these streets for a long time," she laughed softly. "Fair enough." Several minutes passed. The silence should have felt awkward. Instead, it felt strangely comfortable, almost insulated from the chaos beyond the rain-covered glass. Neon lights reflected across his profile, briefly revealing sharp features and calm grey-blue eyes focused entirely on the road ahead. Then Grace noticed something else. Instead of heading toward Queens, where her apartment waited above a corner grocery store, the SUV crossed another intersection and continued west. She leaned forward slightly. I think you missed the turn." "Did I?" he asked without sounding concerned. Grace opened her rideshare app again. The loading circle continued, spinning before the screen refreshed. There was no active trip, no driver's name, no vehicle information, no receipt, nothing. Her heartbeat slowed for just a second as confusion quietly replaced exhaustion. She looked through the windshield, then back toward the composed stranger behind the wheel. "I'm sorry," she said, forcing a nervous laugh. "This is going to sound ridiculous, but what company do you drive for?" He didn't answer immediately. The city lights slipped across the windshield while rain continued whispering against the glass. Finally he spoke, almost as if the question itself carried no urgency at all. "I don't." Grace stared at him, trying to decide whether he was joking. Unfortunately for her, less than a mile away, 3 black sedans had already begun searching every street where they believed one particular SUV was supposed to be waiting. and none of the men inside those cars had any idea that an exhausted hotel employee had unknowingly stepped into the only vehicle capable of changing every plan they had made that night. Grace stared at the man behind the wheel, waiting for the hint of a smile that would reveal the joke. None came. The windshield wipers swept steadily across the glass, pushing away another wave of heavy rain before the city lights blurred together again. Her fingers tightened around her phone. The rideshare application still showed no active trip, no driver profile, no receipt, only the same empty home screen that suddenly felt far less comforting than it had moments earlier. She forced herself to breathe normally. There had to be a simple explanation. Maybe the application had crashed. Maybe he drove for a private service. Maybe she had climbed into the wrong vehicle without noticing. New York rewarded confidence and punished panic. She had learned that years ago. So, if you are not a driver, she asked carefully, why did you stop? The man kept his attention on the road ahead. Because you looked like someone who needed to get out of the rain. His answer was so calm that it almost sounded ordinary. Grace blinked. Most people would have corrected me. Most people probably would have. She looked out the side window, searching for familiar streets. Instead, she saw office towers sliding past in long reflections across the wet pavement. The route still felt wrong, not dangerous, just unfamiliar. My apartment is in Queens, she said. I know. That answer made her turn back immediately. How could you possibly know that? He finally glanced toward her for a brief second before returning his eyes to traffic. You mentioned it while you were checking your phone. Grace replayed the last few minutes in her head. He was right. She had mumbled something about getting back to Queens after seeing the subway delay. Relief mixed with embarrassment. She hated feeling careless. Right, she said quietly. I guess I did. Silence settled between them again, but it no longer felt peaceful. It felt observant. Every movement inside the vehicle seemed deliberate, from the steady speed to the careful lane changes that never appeared rushed. Whoever this man was, he drove with the confidence of someone who expected the road to make room for him. They stopped at a red light. A homeless veteran stood beneath a bus shelter, soaked despite the roof above him. Before Grace could look away, the driver reached toward the center console, picked up a sealed paper bag, lowered his window and handed it to the man without saying a word. The veteran nodded with quiet gratitude. The light turned green, the SUV rolled forward again. Grace looked at the empty space where the bag had been. You planned that, she asked. I pass this intersection every Thursday. You always bring food? Usually. She studied his profile. Expensive coat, immaculate suit. A watch that looked like it belonged behind museum glass. Nothing about him matched the quiet gesture she had just witnessed. It unsettled her because it refused to fit the picture she had already built in her mind. You still have not told me your name, she said. Luca. Grace. He nodded once, as though he had expected the introduction all along. Unfortunately for Grace, what she could not see was a black sedan slowing 2 blocks behind them before disappearing into another avenue after losing sight of the SUV in the rain. Inside that sedan, a frustrated voice quietly instructed everyone to keep searching. Back inside the SUV, Grace noticed another detail. There were no family photographs, no decorations, no coffee stains. Everything inside looked untouched, almost like a private office instead of a personal vehicle. You really are not much of a talker, are you? She asked with a faint smile. Only when talking improves the situation. Does it ever? Sometimes. She laughed despite herself. That might be the most mysterious answer I have heard all year. For the first time, the corner of Luca's mouth lifted into the smallest hint of a smile. It disappeared almost immediately, but Grace caught it. Somehow that made the silence easier to accept. Then she noticed the street sign outside. They were nowhere near the highway toward Queens anymore. The SUV turned through a pair of open iron gates guarded by stone pillars. Beyond them stretched a long private driveway lined with old maple trees whose leaves shimmered beneath carefully placed lights. Grace sat upright. Wait, she said, looking from the gates back to Luca. Where exactly are we going? Luca slowed the vehicle without answering immediately. His expression remained calm, but his eyes shifted briefly toward the rearview mirror before settling back on the driveway ahead. Somewhere, he said quietly. That is much safer than where you thought you were going. As the gates closed silently behind them, Grace realized she no longer had any idea where she was, and for reasons she could not yet explain. The storm outside suddenly felt less frightening than whatever waited beyond the lights ahead. Grace remained seated for several long seconds after the iron gates closed behind the black SUV. The sound echoed softly through the rain, not like a prison door locking, but like the final page of one chapter quietly giving way to another. The long driveway stretched ahead beneath rows of old maple trees whose golden leaves shimmered beneath carefully placed lights. Every few yards, stone lanterns illuminated the wet pavement with a warm glow that somehow made the estate feel more welcoming than intimidating. Even so, nothing about the place appeared on any map she could remember. Her phone displayed only one weak signal before losing reception completely. She slipped it back into her pocket and looked toward Luca. His expression had not changed since the moment she stepped into the vehicle. Calm, focused, impossible to read. The SUV rolled to a smooth stop beneath the covered entrance of a massive limestone residence whose architecture blended classic American elegance with subtle European influences. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the rain while soft amber light spilled across polished stone steps. Grace had spent years serving wealthy guests at luxury events, yet she had never seen a private home that carried such quiet confidence. There were no extravagant fountains or unnecessary displays. Everything felt intentional, timeless. As Luca stepped out first, a middle-aged man wearing a dark suit opened the front door before either of them reached the entrance. He nodded respectfully without speaking. Grace noticed something unusual. No one appeared nervous around Luca. They simply acknowledged him with effortless professionalism, the way people greeted someone they deeply respected rather than feared. "Miss Morgan," the older man said warmly. "Welcome, I am Henry." Grace blinked. "You know my name too?" Henry smiled politely. "Mr. Moretti prefers that every guest feels expected." Guest, the word settled her nerves more than she expected. Luca turned slightly toward her. "You are free to leave whenever you decide you are comfortable doing so. Tonight I only ask that you come inside while the weather passes." His voice carried no pressure, only certainty. Grace studied him for another moment before following them through the front entrance. Warm air wrapped around her immediately, carrying the faint scent of cedar wood, fresh coffee, and old books. The foyer opened into an expansive hall lined with paintings that seemed less like expensive collectibles and more like family memories preserved across generations. A grandfather clock ticked steadily near a sweeping staircase. Somewhere deeper inside the house, soft piano music drifted through the silence. "This does not look like the home of someone who spends every night driving strangers around Manhattan," Grace said with a nervous laugh. Luca almost smiled again. "I told you I was not a driver." "You certainly left out a few details." Henry gestured toward a sitting room where a fireplace crackled gently despite the mild autumn temperature outside. A tray with hot tea and freshly baked pastries waited on a low wooden table, as though someone had anticipated exactly what an exhausted guest might need after standing in the rain. Grace hesitated. "You planned all of this?" Henry answered before Luca could. "We prepare for unexpected visitors more often than most people imagine." The answer only created more questions. Grace wrapped both hands around a warm porcelain cup and finally allowed herself to breathe. Her shoulders relaxed for the first time since leaving the hotel. Across the room, Luca stood beside the large windows overlooking the rain-soaked gardens. He never reached for the tea. He simply watched the weather in thoughtful silence. Grace noticed a framed photograph resting on a nearby bookshelf. It showed a younger Luca surrounded by volunteers rebuilding homes after a devastating coastal storm. Another photograph captured him attending a children's literacy fundraiser. None of the images matched the mysterious figure she had imagined during the drive. "You keep surprising me," she admitted quietly. "Most people surprise themselves before they surprise anyone else," Luca replied without turning around. Before Grace could answer, the soft vibration of a phone interrupted the room. Henry glanced down at the screen in his hand. His warm expression faded ever so slightly before returning to normal. He crossed the room and spoke quietly enough that Grace could not hear the words. Luca listened without interrupting. His eyes shifted briefly toward the front windows, then toward the security monitors mounted discreetly inside a nearby study. Several camera feeds displayed empty roads surrounding the estate. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet something in Henry's measured tone suggested otherwise. Grace pretended to examine another painting while watching their reflection in the glass. She caught only one sentence from Luca: "Do not let anyone know she is here." Henry nodded once and disappeared down the hallway without another word. Grace slowly lowered her teacup. She had arrived believing she had mistaken one vehicle for another. Now she was beginning to wonder whether someone else had mistaken her for somebody far more important than she could possibly be. What she did not know was that less than 30 minutes earlier, someone had already started asking a single question across several neighborhoods of Manhattan. Who was the young woman who entered Luca Moretti's vehicle, and why had she changed the course of a night that had been planned down to the very last minute? Grace could not stop thinking about Luca's final sentence. "Do not let anyone know she is here." The words echoed quietly in her mind long after Henry disappeared into the hallway. She set the empty teacup onto its saucer and walked toward the tall windows overlooking the rain-soaked gardens. The storm had begun to weaken, leaving a thin mist drifting above perfectly trimmed hedges and ancient oak trees that seemed older than the city itself. Somewhere beyond the estate, distant thunder rolled softly across the night, but inside the house everything remained strangely peaceful. It felt less like the residence of a powerful man, and more like a place carefully designed to protect silence. Grace turned when she heard footsteps approaching. Henry returned carrying a folded cardigan in one hand and a small paper shopping bag in the other. "Your jacket is still drying," he said with a gentle smile. "We asked one of the staff to pick up a few essentials in case you wish to freshen up before heading home." Grace looked inside the bag and found a toothbrush, travel-sized toiletries, warm socks, and a simple sweater that still carried its store tag. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that suggested anyone expected her to stay longer than necessary. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Everyone here keeps treating me as though I belong." Henry's smile softened. "Mr. Moretti believes unexpected guests deserve the same kindness as expected ones." Before Grace could reply, a grandfather clock chimed midnight somewhere deeper inside the house. The sound lingered through the hall like a reminder that the evening had become something entirely different from the ordinary workday she had expected. After changing into the dry sweater, she wandered carefully through a nearby library whose towering bookshelves stretched almost to the ceiling. Leather-bound classics stood beside biographies, architecture books, and collections on American history. A large map of New York covered one wall, marked not with business districts or investment properties, but with handwritten notes highlighting community centers, schools, and restoration projects. Grace stepped closer, puzzled. Small photographs were pinned beside several neighborhoods, showing renovated playgrounds, reopened libraries, and rebuilt apartment buildings. She heard Luca's voice behind her. "The city remembers people who invest in its future." She turned, slightly embarrassed at being caught studying the display. "I thought this map would be filled with companies you own." "Buildings matter," he replied. "People matter more." Grace searched his expression for sarcasm and found none. "Then why does everyone act as though you are some impossible man to approach?" Luca looked toward the map rather than at her. "Power often creates distance, even when no one asks for it." The answer lingered between them. Grace realized she still knew almost nothing about him, yet every response seemed to replace one assumption with another question. Suddenly, a soft electronic tone sounded from a nearby security monitor mounted discreetly inside a wooden cabinet. Luca walked toward the screen. Grace remained where she stood, careful not to invade his privacy, but she noticed his attention sharpen immediately. One of the cameras displayed a black SUV, slowing briefly near the entrance road before continuing past the estate without stopping. Another camera captured the same vehicle several minutes later from a different angle farther down the road. The driver never attempted to enter the property, yet the timing felt too deliberate to ignore. "Friends of yours?" Grace asked with an uneasy smile. Luca studied the screen for another moment before it returned to its normal display. "Someone appears curious about who visited tonight." Grace folded her arms instinctively. "You really think that has something to do with me?" "I think coincidences deserve to be questioned before they are trusted." His calm answer carried no alarm, only careful observation. Grace walked back toward the windows, watching the rain finally begin to slow into scattered droplets. She suddenly remembered the hotel entrance, the broken rideshare application, the unfamiliar SUV, and every strange event that had followed. None of it seemed frightening anymore. It simply felt unfinished, like pieces of a puzzle still waiting for their proper place. Henry entered once more, this time carrying Grace's fully dried jacket. "The weather has improved," he said. "Whenever you are ready, one of our drivers can take you anywhere you wish." Grace accepted the jacket, but did not put it on immediately. Instead, she looked toward Luca. "Can I ask you one honest question?" "Of course. If I had never waved at your vehicle tonight, what would you have been doing instead?" Luca paused just long enough to make the silence meaningful. "Driving to a meeting I no longer believe was the most important part of my evening." Grace could not explain why those words stayed with her. They were simple, almost ordinary, yet they carried a sincerity she had not expected. Unfortunately for both of them, less than 2 miles away, a security camera mounted outside Grace's apartment building quietly recorded an unfamiliar visitor stopping across the street, studying the entrance for several minutes before walking away without knocking on a single door, leaving behind one question that neither Grace nor Luca yet realized they would soon have to answer. Grace expected relief the moment she stepped outside, but the cool October air only sharpened the questions circling her mind. The rain had faded into a fine mist that clung to the stone driveway, turning every light into a soft golden halo. One of the estate's black sedans waited quietly beneath the covered entrance, its headlights glowing against the wet pavement. Henry opened the rear door with the same calm professionalism he had shown all evening. "Our driver can take you anywhere you wish, Miss Morgan." Grace thanked him but remained standing for another moment. She looked back toward the grand entrance where Lucas stood beneath the warm light spilling from the doorway. He did not ask her to stay. He did not try to persuade her. He simply nodded once, as though respecting whatever decision she made mattered more than influencing it. That simple gesture unsettled her more than anything else had that night. She climbed into the sedan, and within minutes the estate disappeared behind rows of maple trees as the city slowly returned around them. The skyline glowed beneath low clouds, and familiar streets gradually replaced the quiet countryside surrounding the residence. Grace leaned against the window, replaying every conversation from the evening. None of it fit together. A mysterious man who claimed he was not a driver, a house filled with books instead of trophies, employees who treated strangers like honored guests, a map dedicated to rebuilding neighborhoods instead of expanding business. It felt less like meeting someone powerful and more like discovering an entire world hidden behind assumptions. Halfway back to Queens, her phone vibrated repeatedly as service finally returned. Text messages flooded the screen. 3 missed calls from her co-worker Melissa. 1 message from her landlord reminding tenants about scheduled maintenance. Another from her younger brother asking whether she could attend his college debate tournament that weekend. Everything looked wonderfully ordinary until the final notification appeared. "Unknown number. I believe something belonging to you was left behind tonight. Please call when convenient." There was no signature. Grace frowned. She quickly searched her purse. Wallet, keys, employee badge, phone charger, everything appeared to be there. She showed the message to the driver. "Did someone from the house send this?" The driver glanced briefly through the rearview mirror before returning his attention to the road. "I do not recognize the number, Miss Morgan." A quiet chill settled over her shoulders. She decided not to answer. 10 minutes later, the sedan pulled up outside her apartment building in Queens. The neighborhood looked exactly as she remembered. A small grocery store remained open on the corner. Steam drifted from a nearby subway entrance. Someone walked a golden retriever beneath a bright umbrella while a group of college students laughed outside a late-night pizza shop. Normal life continued exactly where she had left it. Grace thanked the driver and stepped onto the sidewalk. Before entering her building, she instinctively glanced across the street. A silver sedan sat parked beneath a flickering streetlight with its lights turned off. She could not see anyone inside through the rain-covered windows. Perhaps it belonged to a neighbor. Perhaps she was simply imagining connections after such an unusual evening. Even so, she found herself walking a little faster toward the entrance. Upstairs, her tiny apartment welcomed her with familiar imperfections. The old radiator clicked every few seconds. A stack of unpaid utility bills waited on the kitchen counter. She kicked off her damp shoes, changed into comfortable clothes, and finally allowed herself to collapse onto the sofa. Sleep should have come easily after such a long shift, yet her thoughts refused to slow down. She opened her laptop and searched for Luca Moretti. Hundreds of results appeared. Most described him as a remarkably private entrepreneur whose investment company quietly funded community restoration projects across New York and neighboring states. Interviews were almost impossible to find. Public appearances were rare. Every article described influence, vision, and unusual generosity, yet none explained why strangers lowered their voices whenever his name appeared in conversation. Grace closed the computer with more questions than answers. Her phone vibrated again, the same unknown number. This time a photograph arrived instead of a message. It showed a simple navy blue scarf neatly folded across the back seat of the SUV she had entered earlier that evening. Only then did Grace remember wrapping the scarf around her shoulders during the storm before leaving it behind. A second message appeared immediately afterward. "We would like to return it whenever it is convenient for you." There was still no signature, Grace stared at the screen, uncertain whether fate had simply become unusually persistent or whether the evening had only just begun. Unfortunately for her, several blocks away, the silver sedan quietly pulled away from the curb the exact moment the lights inside her apartment turned off, leaving behind only wet tire tracks and another unanswered question waiting for the next sunrise. Grace slept only a few hours before the pale light of early morning filtered through the thin curtains of her apartment. The city outside had already returned to its familiar rhythm. Delivery trucks rumbled below her window. A coffee cart on the corner welcomed its first customers. Somewhere in the hallway, a neighbor struggled with groceries while an old radio played soft jazz through an open door. Everything looked perfectly ordinary, yet the strange events of the previous night refused to fade into memory. She picked up her phone and opened the photograph of the navy blue scarf once again. The fabric rested neatly across the back seat of Luca's SUV, exactly where she must have left it. Whoever had taken the picture had done so respectfully. There was no pressure in the message, no demand, only a simple offer to return something she had forgotten. Grace almost convinced herself to ignore it until another notification appeared. "Did you make it?" From Melissa. "Did you make it home last night?" Asking if anyone had seen you after your shift. Grace sat upright immediately. She called Melissa without hesitation. "Who asked about me?" Melissa answered after the second ring. "I do not know." He was polite, mid-40s maybe, well-dressed. He said he thought you might have left behind an important document after the reception. It sounded harmless, but something about the conversation felt strange. Grace looked toward her apartment door. "Did he leave a name?" "No, management assumed he represented one of the guests. They checked the lost and found. Nothing was missing." Grace thanked her friend and ended the call, but the uneasy feeling returned stronger than before. The mysterious visitor knew where she worked. Someone else had appeared near her apartment the previous evening. None of it made sense. Before she could overthink the situation, another message appeared from the same unknown number. "Good morning, Miss Morgan. Your scarf is waiting whenever it is convenient. There is also something you may wish to see." The message ended with an address in Midtown and a time. Noon. No explanation followed. Grace stared at the screen for nearly a minute before typing a cautious reply. "Is Mr. Moretti expecting me?" A response arrived almost instantly. "He does not expect you. He hopes you will choose to come." The wording caught her attention. It left the decision entirely in her hands. By late morning, curiosity had become impossible to ignore. She finished several errands, attended her brother's online debate practice for a few minutes, and eventually found herself standing outside an elegant brick building overlooking Bryant Park. It was neither a mansion nor a corporate skyscraper. The polished brass sign beside the entrance simply read Moretti Foundation. Through the glass doors, she could see families, students, and volunteers moving through a bright lobby filled with natural light. A receptionist greeted her with a warm smile. "Miss Morgan, Mr. Moretti asked us to return something that belongs to you." Grace accepted the neatly folded scarf, surprised to find it freshly cleaned and wrapped inside simple tissue paper. "Thank you," she said. "I do not want to interrupt his work." "You are not interrupting anything," the receptionist replied. "He is upstairs visiting today's scholarship recipients if you would like to say hello." Grace hesitated before following the directions to the third floor. The elevator doors opened onto a spacious community center where dozens of high school students gathered around tables displaying science projects, artwork, and engineering models. Volunteers moved from group to group offering encouragement. At the far end of the room, Luca stood speaking with an elderly teacher while listening attentively to a teenager explain a robotics prototype. There were no cameras, no reporters, no formal speeches, just genuine conversations. Grace remained near the entrance, quietly observing. The version of Luca she saw here felt even more difficult to reconcile with the mysterious man who had driven through the rain the previous night. Eventually, he noticed her and excused himself from the conversation. "I am glad your scarf found its way back to you," he said. Grace smiled despite herself. "You could have mailed it." "I could have. Then why invite me here?" Luca glanced around the room where students laughed over their projects. "Because first impressions are often incomplete." Grace followed to see this. "I wanted you to see something real." Before she could answer, one of the volunteers hurried toward Luca, carrying a tablet. His expression remained calm as he reviewed whatever appeared on the screen, but Grace noticed the subtle change in his posture. He looked toward the large windows overlooking the street below. A familiar silver sedan had parked across from the building. It remained there for only a few seconds before pulling back into traffic without anyone getting out. Luca returned the tablet to the volunteer as though nothing unusual had happened. "Is everything all right?" Grace asked. He met her eyes with quiet reassurance. "Probably, but sometimes the smallest questions deserve the closest attention." What Grace did not know was that someone had now appeared near her workplace, her apartment, and the foundation within less than 24 hours. And for the first time, Luca began to wonder whether the unexpected ride through the rain had connected two lives for a reason neither of them had discovered yet. Grace remained by the third-floor window long after the silver sedan disappeared into midtown traffic. She told herself it was only another passing car, another ordinary coincidence in a city filled with millions of strangers, yet the uneasy feeling refused to leave. Luca thanked the volunteer who had brought him the tablet before turning back toward the students gathered around the exhibits. He did not rush after the vehicle. He did not issue dramatic instructions. Instead, he spent another 15 minutes listening patiently as a young engineering student explained a solar-powered water filtration project. Grace found that strangely reassuring. Whatever responsibility Luca carried, he never allowed it to eclipse the people standing directly in front of him. When the presentation ended, several students gathered around him for photographs. They laughed easily. Parents thanked him for supporting scholarships that had opened doors they never imagined possible. Grace watched every interaction carefully, searching for the intimidating figure she had imagined during that rainy night. Instead, she found someone who remembered names, asked thoughtful questions, and celebrated other people's achievements without drawing attention to himself. As the last guests departed, the community center gradually became quiet again. Afternoon sunlight broke through thinning clouds, filling the room with warm golden light that reflected across polished wooden floors. Luca approached Grace carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "You look like you could use one," he said. She accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thank you." They walked together toward a rooftop terrace overlooking Bryant Park. The city stretched endlessly around them. Yellow taxis flowed through intersections below while people hurried between office buildings, completely unaware that one unexpected meeting had already begun changing 2 ordinary lives. Grace rested her hands against the cool stone railing. "Can I ask you something without you giving me another mysterious answer?" Luca smiled faintly. "You may try," she laughed softly. "Yesterday you told me I accidentally stepped into your vehicle. Today someone asked about me at the hotel, another person watched my apartment, and now the same silver sedan appears outside this building. Are these really just coincidences?" Luca looked across the skyline before answering. "I do not believe in ignoring patterns, neither do I anymore." He nodded once. "That is probably wise." Grace folded her arms. "Then tell me what I am missing." Luca remained silent for several seconds, choosing his words carefully. "Do you remember exactly where you were standing before you entered my vehicle?" Grace replayed the memory. Rain, hotel entrance, streetlights reflecting across wet pavement, her ride-share application refusing to load. "I was standing near the east side entrance of the hotel." "Not the main entrance?" "No, the main entrance was crowded after the wedding reception." Luca looked toward the park below. "That small difference may matter more than either of us realized." Grace frowned. "Why?" "Because I was not originally supposed to drive past that entrance." The statement settled heavily between them. It was not a complete explanation, but it was the first genuine crack in the mystery. Grace searched her memory again, this time more carefully. She remembered checking her phone. She remembered waving at the SUV. Then another image surfaced. Just before Luca's vehicle stopped, another identical black SUV had driven through the same intersection from the opposite direction. She had dismissed it without thinking. There were 2 vehicles, she whispered almost to herself. Luca slowly turned toward her. "You noticed. Only now. Most people would not have." Grace looked back toward the skyline. "Does that mean someone expected a different SUV?" Luca did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and unfolded a printed photograph. It showed the hotel entrance captured from a nearby traffic camera. Grace recognized herself standing beneath the blue umbrella. She also recognized Luca's SUV pulling toward the curb. Then she noticed something she had completely missed. Less than 20 feet behind her stood a man holding a dark folder beneath his coat, looking toward the same section of the street. His face remained partially hidden beneath an umbrella. "Who is he?" Grace asked quietly. Luca shook his head. "We do not know yet. Why are you showing me this now?" "Because yesterday I believed your arrival was simply unexpected." He looked back at the photograph before folding it carefully once more. Today I am beginning to think your arrival interrupted something neither of us was supposed to see. Grace felt a chill despite the afternoon sun warming the rooftop. Every assumption she had made during the past 24 hours shifted once again. She had believed she entered the wrong vehicle by accident. Now another possibility quietly emerged. Perhaps she had unknowingly stepped into the only vehicle that was never meant to stop for her at all. At that exact moment, several blocks away, a city traffic analyst reviewing archived camera footage paused on the same intersection from the previous night after noticing two nearly identical black SUVs crossing paths within 8 seconds of each other. Unaware that the answer hidden inside those few seconds would soon change everything Grace believed about the rainy night that had started it all, Grace could not take her eyes off the traffic camera photograph. The frozen image seemed ordinary at first glance, yet the more impossible it became to ignore. There she was beneath the faded blue umbrella, exhausted after a late shift, raising one hand toward the black SUV she believed was her ride home. Just behind her stood the unidentified man holding a dark folder beneath his coat, while another nearly identical SUV crossed the intersection only seconds later. Until now she had believed every strange event began the moment she opened Luca's passenger door. Suddenly the timeline shifted inside her mind. Whatever had happened that rainy night had already been unfolding before she ever stepped off the hotel sidewalk. Grace slowly handed the photograph back to Luca. "You think I interrupted something?" Luca folded the paper carefully before placing it inside his coat pocket. "I think your decision changed the sequence of events." Grace searched his expression for certainty. Instead, she found thoughtful caution. "That is different, very different," he replied quietly. "Assumptions solve very little, patterns solve much more." The afternoon breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves across the rooftop as people continued filling Bryant Park below. Office workers crossed walkways with coffee cups in hand. Children laughed around a carousel. The ordinary rhythm of New York continued without realizing that two strangers had just uncovered the first real piece of an unexpected mystery. Grace looked toward the skyline. "What was supposed to happen if I never got into your vehicle?" Luca answered honestly. "I still do not know." That answer surprised her more than any elaborate explanation could have. Powerful people were expected to have answers. Luca seemed comfortable admitting when he did not. Before either of them spoke again, Henry stepped onto the rooftop carrying a slim tablet. His expression remained composed, yet Grace noticed the same quiet seriousness she had seen inside the estate. "The traffic analysis team sent additional footage," Henry said. Luca reviewed several images before turning the screen toward Grace. The recording showed the intersection from another camera angle nearly 2 minutes before she appeared. A maintenance van had briefly stopped near the curb before driving away. Nothing seemed unusual until Henry zoomed closer. One employee exited the van for less than 30 seconds, adjusted a temporary construction sign near the sidewalk, and returned to the vehicle. Why does that matter? Henry enlarged another frame. The sign had redirected pedestrians away from the hotel's main entrance toward the quieter side entrance where Grace had waited. She stared at the screen. "I never even noticed that sign." "Most people would not," Henry said. Grace slowly looked back toward Luca. "So I only stood there because someone moved the pedestrian route." Luca nodded once. "That appears to be true." A quiet silence settled over the rooftop as the realization unfolded piece by piece. Grace had believed she chose that location herself. Instead, a small change in the sidewalk had guided hundreds of pedestrians without attracting attention. It could have been routine city maintenance, it could have been coincidence, or it could have been something far more deliberate. "Does this happen often?" Grace asked. Luca looked across the city before answering. "Small details influence large outcomes every day. Most people simply never discover them." Grace thought about her entire evening: a delayed subway, a rideshare application that refused to connect, a redirected sidewalk, two nearly identical SUVs. Every event had seemed harmless on its own. Together they formed a pattern impossible to dismiss. Her phone vibrated gently. Melissa had sent another message along with a photograph from the hotel security office. Grace opened it immediately. The image showed hotel guests leaving through the revolving doors only minutes before she finished work. In the corner of the frame stood the same unidentified man from Luca's traffic photograph. This time his face was clearer. He appeared to be studying the temporary construction sign rather than the guests. Grace showed the image to Luca without saying a word. He examined it carefully. "This confirms one thing." "What?" He arrived before you did. Grace felt another piece of the puzzle slide into place. Whoever the man was, he had never been following her personally. He had been watching the location itself. That single realization transformed fear into curiosity. Then I was never the reason he came. Luca met her eyes. Perhaps not, but I became part of whatever happened afterward. Yes, neither of them noticed that the sun had already begun dropping behind the Manhattan skyline, bathing the city in warm amber light. Grace slipped her phone back into her pocket and looked over the endless rooftops stretching toward the horizon. For the first time since that rainy night, she no longer felt like an accidental passenger caught inside someone else's story. She felt like the only witness who had unknowingly seen the beginning of a much larger puzzle. At that exact moment, inside the city's traffic management archive, the analyst reviewing the recordings discovered one final camera angle showing the second black SUV slowing unexpectedly after Grace entered Luca's vehicle, lingering at the intersection for several silent seconds before turning away, leaving behind one unmistakable conclusion. Someone else had expected that corner to be empty, and Grace's simple mistake had quietly rewritten plans that had been carefully arranged long before the rain ever began. Grace left the rooftop carrying far more questions than answers, yet for the first time those questions felt connected instead of random. The city glowed beneath the early evening sky as Manhattan settled into its familiar rhythm of headlights, distant sirens, and endless conversations drifting from crowded sidewalks. She followed Luca through the quiet lobby of the Moretti Foundation, passing families leaving community programs and volunteers stacking chairs after another successful event. Every face she saw reflected gratitude rather than obligation, reinforcing the impression that Luca's influence reached far beyond business. Just before they reached the entrance, Henry approached carrying a slim envelope sealed with a simple silver emblem. The traffic analyst delivered the complete report, he said. Luca thanked him and looked toward Grace. There is something you deserve to know. They stepped into a private conference room overlooking Bryant Park. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline while the fading sunlight painted long golden reflections across the polished wooden table. Luca opened the envelope and removed several printed images arranged in chronological order. Grace recognized the intersection immediately. The first photograph showed the temporary construction sign being placed beside the sidewalk. The second showed hotel guests naturally adjusting their path. The third captured Grace walking toward the quieter entrance while looking down at her phone. Then came the image she had already seen, showing her waving toward Luca's SUV. Finally, the last photograph revealed the second black SUV before quietly turning away after she entered Luca's vehicle. Grace stared at the sequence. It really changed because of me. Luca nodded yes, but why? He rested both hands lightly against the table before answering. Yesterday evening I was scheduled to meet several philanthropic partners to discuss a long-planned redevelopment project for several neighborhoods. Another vehicle identical to mine had been assigned to transport a group of guests arriving separately. The route timing was coordinated to the minute. Grace followed every photograph again. Then when I entered your vehicle, the schedule shifted. Only by a few minutes. Sometimes a few minutes are enough to change everything. Grace looked up. The second vehicle waited because it expected you to continue driving. Exactly. She slowly pieced the story together. When you stopped for me, everyone else's timing changed without realizing why. Luca gave a faint smile. That is our current conclusion. Grace leaned back in her chair, trying to absorb the simplicity of it. There had been no elaborate conspiracy surrounding her. No secret hidden in her past, no mysterious connection she had forgotten. She had simply made an ordinary mistake at the exact moment. Several carefully coordinated schedules depended upon perfect timing. One unexpected passenger had quietly rearranged an entire evening. Then the man near the hotel? She asked. Henry answered this time. We believe he was observing arrivals connected to the redevelopment meeting. He appears in every available camera angle. Grace looked toward the photographs once more. Was he watching me? No, Henry replied. Everything suggests he never even noticed you until after you entered Mr. Moretti's vehicle. A strange mixture of relief and disbelief settled over her. The fear she had carried for 2 days slowly transformed into something else. Wonder. She had not been the target. She had become the unexpected variable that no careful plan had anticipated. Luca folded the photographs back into the envelope. There is one more piece. Grace waited quietly. The redevelopment proposal contains bids from several organizations. One anonymous submission arrived yesterday morning using information that had not yet been released publicly. Grace frowned. Someone had access they should not have had. That is what concerns us. Henry placed another document on the table. Once the schedule changed, the anonymous representatives never appeared for the meeting. They disappeared before anyone realized the timeline had shifted. Grace looked from Henry to Luca. So whoever was expecting everything to happen exactly on schedule abandoned the plan after I entered your vehicle. That is our strongest theory, Luca replied. The room fell silent. Outside, office workers crossed the park beneath strings of newly illuminated lights, while evening settled gently across the city. Grace finally understood why Luca had never tried to frighten her with dramatic explanations. He had waited until the facts formed a complete picture. That patience impressed her more than certainty ever could. She smiled softly. All because I thought your SUV was my ride home, Luca returned the smile, subtle but genuine. Life occasionally writes better stories than careful planning. Grace laughed quietly for the first time since the rainy night began. The tension between them eased, replaced by mutual trust built not through promises, but through shared understanding. Yet as they prepared to leave the conference room, Henry's phone vibrated with an incoming message. He glanced at the screen, his calm expression remaining unchanged, though his eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. The city archive located one final security recording, he said. It shows the unidentified observer entering another building less than 5 minutes after leaving the hotel. Grace paused near the doorway. Can they identify the building? Henry looked toward Luca before answering. Yes, it belongs to one of the organizations competing for the redevelopment contract. Luca slowly reached for his coat, knowing that for the first time the mystery was no longer about chance alone. Someone had quietly attempted to influence the future of an entire community, and an exhausted young woman searching for a ride home had unknowingly become the reason that carefully arranged plan never unfolded as expected. Grace stood motionless for several seconds after Henry revealed the name of the organization connected to the final security recording. The conference room suddenly felt quieter than before, as though the city itself had paused outside the glass walls to listen. Evening settled gently over Manhattan, replacing the golden glow of late afternoon with thousands of lights stretching across the skyline. Below them, Bryant Park remained alive with people finishing their workday, completely unaware that a single unexpected decision had quietly prevented a carefully orchestrated plan from unfolding exactly as intended. Grace slowly exhaled. So whoever arranged that meeting expected everything to happen on schedule. Henry nodded. Every detail depended on precise timing. Luca rested one hand against the back of a chair, studying the city rather than the documents. When I stopped my vehicle, the schedule changed. The delay itself was insignificant. The consequences were not. Grace looked toward him, and because the timing changed, someone abandoned whatever they intended to do. That appears to be exactly what happened. She lowered her eyes to the photographs once more. For 2 days she had believed she was following someone else's story. Now she realized she had unknowingly interrupted it. Not through courage, not through careful planning, simply because she had mistaken one black SUV for another during a rainstorm. Henry placed another folder on the table. The organization connected to the unidentified observer withdrew its redevelopment proposal early this morning. Grace frowned. Without an explanation, without any communication at all. Luca opened the folder and quietly reviewed several pages before handing one across the table. It summarized the city's redevelopment process, listing several non-profit partners competing to restore neglected neighborhoods through affordable housing, educational programs, and community investment. Grace noticed one sentence highlighted in blue ink. Independent oversight requires complete transparency from every participating organization. She looked up. Someone realized transparency was about to expose something inconsistent. Luca gave a slight nod. That is our conclusion. Grace walked toward the windows again, watching lights appear one by one inside surrounding office buildings. Do you ever get tired of seeing patterns everywhere? She asked softly. Luca joined her beside the glass. Sometimes, but ignoring them has never improved a difficult situation. She smiled faintly. You really answer questions differently than everyone else. Is that a compliment? Grace laughed quietly. I think it is. The conversation drifted into a comfortable silence. It was no longer filled with uncertainty, but with quiet understanding. Grace realized she no longer felt nervous standing beside him. The mystery remained unresolved, yet trust had begun replacing suspicion. A gentle knock interrupted the moment. One of the foundation coordinators stepped inside carrying a tablet. Mr. Moretti, the neighborhood council just confirmed tomorrow morning's announcement. The redevelopment partnership has officially been approved. Luca thanked her before turning toward Grace. Would you like to see what all of this was actually meant to accomplish? She hesitated only briefly before nodding. Early the following morning, sunlight reflected across the East River as Luca's SUV crossed into Brooklyn. Instead of skyscrapers or private offices, Grace found herself standing inside a neighborhood where volunteers painted playground equipment while construction crews restored historic apartment buildings. Children chased one another across freshly paved sidewalks. Local musicians prepared a small stage for an upcoming community festival. Elderly residents greeted volunteers by name from apartment windows decorated with flower boxes. Nothing about the project resembled a business transaction. It felt like hope taking physical shape. Grace slowly turned toward Luca. This is what everyone has been working for. Yes, you never mentioned any of this. I preferred you to see it rather than hear about it. She watched a little girl hand fresh lemonade to one of the construction workers before running back toward her family, laughing beneath the warm morning sun. Now I understand why timing mattered. Luca looked across the neighborhood with quiet satisfaction. Some opportunities disappear if the right people lose confidence. Grace nodded thoughtfully. Then maybe the wrong plan failed because the right one needed a chance. Luca met her eyes for a brief moment, and for the first time since the rainy night began, neither of them seemed to be thinking about mystery alone. They were thinking about possibility. As volunteers gathered for the opening ceremony, Grace noticed a familiar face standing near the far edge of the crowd. It was the unidentified man from the traffic photographs. He remained only long enough to observe the celebration before calmly turning away and disappearing among dozens of pedestrians. Grace instinctively looked toward Luca. He had seen him too. Neither of them followed. Instead, Luca quietly reached into his coat pocket and removed the final page from Henry's investigation file. Across the top, written in careful handwriting, appeared a single sentence that changed the entire direction of the mystery. The unidentified observer had never been connected to the redevelopment organization at all. He had been investigating someone inside it. Grace watched the unfamiliar man disappear into the morning crowd until he became only another silhouette among hundreds crossing the newly restored plaza. The music from the community celebration continued behind her as children explored fresh playground equipment and local families gathered beneath rows of blue and white banners fluttering in the crisp autumn breeze. Yet the sentence Luca had quietly revealed moments earlier continued echoing in her thoughts. The observer had not been working against the redevelopment project. He had been investigating someone hidden within it. That single discovery transformed every assumption they had made over the previous 2 days. The mystery no longer centered on an outsider attempting to disrupt the future of the neighborhood. It centered on someone who had already earned the trust of everyone involved. Grace slowly turned toward Luca. That changes everything. He nodded calmly. It changes the question we should have been asking from the beginning. Instead of asking who wanted to interfere, we should have been asking who had something to hide. Luca's expression softened with quiet approval. Exactly. Henry joined them carrying a thin folder and a warm cup of coffee that he silently offered to Grace. The investigator finally agreed to meet, he said. He believes the timing is no longer a coincidence. Less than an hour later, they arrived at a quiet cafe overlooking the Hudson River. It was the kind of neighborhood place where students worked on laptops, retirees read newspapers, and no one paid attention to unfamiliar faces. The investigator was already waiting near the window. He stood as they approached and offered a polite handshake. "My name is Daniel Mercer," he said. "I apologize for the confusion my work has caused." Grace studied him carefully. He looked nothing like the mysterious figure she had imagined. He appeared thoughtful, professional, and slightly exhausted, as though several sleepless nights had finally caught up with him. "You were at the hotel," Grace said. Daniel nodded. "I was, and outside my apartment, only to confirm whether you had been intentionally involved. Once I realized you were simply an unexpected witness, I never approached you." Grace exchanged a brief glance with Luca before sitting down. Daniel placed a small notebook on the table. "I work for an independent ethics review organization hired by one of the charitable partners. Several financial records submitted during the redevelopment process contained inconsistencies, nothing dramatic, just enough to suggest someone inside the partnership had quietly redirected information before official meetings." Grace listened without interrupting. The explanation felt remarkably ordinary compared to the theories she had imagined. "Why did everything stop after that rainy night?" she finally asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "Because schedules reveal character. Someone expected a meeting to unfold in a precise sequence. When that sequence unexpectedly changed, the person I was observing reacted before anyone else did. That reaction confirmed where I needed to look." Luca leaned forward slightly. The delay exposed the inconsistency. "Yes." Daniel opened the notebook to a page filled with carefully organized notes. The individual under review never committed a crime. However, confidential planning information had been shared before public release, creating an unfair advantage during the proposal process. Once the meeting shifted, that individual attempted to withdraw quietly rather than answer difficult questions. Grace slowly realized how surprisingly human the entire situation had become. There had been no hidden empire, no dangerous conspiracy, no elaborate pursuit. Only one person making poor ethical choices while assuming every detail would unfold exactly as expected. "So the project itself was never the problem," she said. Daniel smiled. "Quite the opposite. The project deserved honest leadership. Fortunately, unexpected circumstances revealed the truth before any permanent decisions were made." Silence settled comfortably around the table as sunlight reflected across the river outside. Grace looked toward Luca. Throughout every conversation, he had resisted dramatic conclusions, choosing patience over assumptions. She finally understood why. Truth rarely arrived all at once. It arrived one careful piece at a time. Daniel closed the notebook. The review board completed its investigation this morning. The individual involved voluntarily stepped away from the partnership. The redevelopment program will continue with complete transparency. Grace felt an unexpected wave of relief. The neighborhoods would still receive their investment. Families would still benefit. Children would still have the opportunities she had witnessed only hours earlier. Luca quietly thanked Daniel before they stepped back onto the riverside walkway. A cool breeze carried the scent of the Hudson, while ferries crossed the sparkling water beneath a bright blue sky. Grace smiled as they walked in comfortable silence. "You know something," she said. Luca looked toward her. "What?" "2 days ago, I thought I had accidentally entered the wrong vehicle," he smiled gently. "And now?" She looked across the river before answering. "Now I think I stepped into exactly the one I was supposed to find." Luca did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the skyline where sunlight reflected from hundreds of windows, illuminating the city that had quietly brought two strangers together through nothing more extraordinary than rain, timing, and one ordinary mistake that turned out to be anything but ordinary. What neither of them realized was that the greatest mystery had already been solved. The only question still waiting for an answer was no longer about hidden schedules or forgotten photographs. It was whether two people brought together by chance would choose to remain part of each other's future long after the mystery itself had come to an end. Several days passed with a calm Grace had almost forgotten was possible. Autumn settled comfortably across New York, replacing the tension of unanswered questions with crisp mornings, clear skies, and neighborhood preparing for community festival supported by the newly approved redevelopment program. The investigation had quietly reached its conclusion. Independent reviewers completed their work, the proposal process moved forward under transparent oversight, and the person responsible for sharing confidential planning information voluntarily stepped away from the project before any lasting harm had been done. The headlines remained brief, almost forgettable, but the people living in those neighborhoods would remember the outcome for years. Grace returned to her regular shifts at the hotel, yet ordinary routines no longer felt quite the same. Every time a black SUV stopped beneath the entrance canopy, she smiled to herself before checking the license plate twice. Her co-workers teased her gently about becoming unusually careful, but none of them knew the story hidden behind that quiet habit. Late one afternoon, Melissa walked beside her as they finished work. "You have been smiling a lot more lately," she observed. Grace laughed softly. "Maybe I finally stopped expecting life to make perfect sense." Melissa raised an eyebrow. "That sounds suspiciously philosophical. It is probably just experience." As they stepped outside, the city glowed beneath the warm amber light of early evening. The rain that had changed everything had disappeared days earlier, leaving behind brilliant blue skies and cool October air. Grace's phone vibrated with a message from Henry. "Community garden opening, 6 o'clock. You are invited if your schedule allows." She looked at the invitation for several moments before replying with a simple yes. An hour later, she arrived at a neighborhood rooftop transformed into a public garden overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Children watered newly planted flowers while local musicians performed gentle acoustic music beneath strings of white lights. Elderly residents exchanged gardening tips with college volunteers. It felt less like an official event and more like a gathering of neighbors, celebrating something they had built together. Grace spotted Lucas speaking with a retired school principal beside a small greenhouse. As always, he listened more than he spoke. When he noticed Grace approaching, a quiet smile appeared across his face. "I was hoping you would come." "Henry made it difficult to refuse," Grace replied with a laugh. "He said there would be fresh apple cider." Luca glanced toward Henry, who lifted a paper cup from across the garden with perfect timing. He rarely exaggerates. They wandered slowly between flower beds filled with autumn chrysanthemums, rosemary, lavender, and climbing ivy beginning to turn shades of red and gold. The skyline shimmered beyond the rooftop as the first lights appeared across the city. Grace paused beside a wooden bench overlooking the river. "Everything feels different now." Luca looked out across the skyline. Different because the mystery ended. She considered the question carefully before shaking her head. "Different because I stopped believing every unexpected moment has to be frightening." A comfortable silence settled between them. It was no longer the silence of strangers searching for answers. It was the easy quiet that exists when explanations are no longer necessary. After several moments, Luca reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a small folded card. "I wanted to give you something." Grace accepted it with curious eyes. Inside was a simple photograph taken during the neighborhood celebration a few days earlier. She had not realized anyone captured the moment. In the picture, she stood beside several children planting the first tree in the restored park while sunlight streamed through bright autumn leaves. Luca had remained in the background, speaking with volunteers, almost unnoticed. Across the bottom of the photograph, someone had written a single sentence: "Every neighborhood changes because someone chooses to show up." Grace looked up, visibly moved. "You kept this?" "I asked the photographer for an extra copy." "Why?" Luca answered without hesitation. "Because when people tell the story of this project years from now, they will probably remember new homes, safer streets, and restored parks. Very few will remember the unexpected mistake that quietly protected all of it. I thought at least one person should." Grace smiled, her eyes reflecting the city lights beyond the rooftop garden. "You still believe I changed something important. I know you did." The music drifted softly across the rooftop while families gathered for a group photograph beneath strings of glowing lights. Henry called everyone together with his usual calm efficiency, and laughter spread naturally through the crowd as neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder. Grace looked once more at the photograph in her hands before slipping it carefully into her bag. She realized that the greatest gift Luca had given her was not an answer to every mystery. It was a different way of seeing ordinary moments. Sometimes destiny did not arrive with dramatic speeches or impossible coincidences. Sometimes it arrived disguised as a delayed ride, a rainy evening, and the simple kindness of someone willing to stop when everyone else would have driven past. Nearly 1 year later, the city welcomed another autumn rain. Soft drops traced silver lines across the streets of Manhattan, while yellow taxis moved through evening traffic exactly as they had on the night. Everything quietly began. Grace stood beneath the entrance canopy of the same hotel where she still worked, greeting guests with the same warm smile she had offered countless strangers before. Yet something inside her had changed forever. She no longer believed that ordinary moments were ordinary at all. Every conversation carried possibility. Every unexpected delay could become the beginning of a completely different future. Her co-workers often joked that she noticed details no one else saw. They were right. She noticed the elderly couple helping each other through revolving doors. She noticed a young father kneeling to zip his daughter's raincoat before crossing the street. She noticed a nervous college student rehearsing an interview in the hotel lobby. Life had taught her that the smallest moments often shaped the largest stories. As the evening rush continued, Melissa stepped beside her carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You have been looking at the rain for 5 straight minutes," she teased. Grace accepted the cup with a quiet smile. "I was remembering that mysterious night." Grace laughed softly. "It does not feel mysterious anymore." Before Melissa could answer, a familiar black SUV turned the corner and slowed toward the entrance. Grace recognized it immediately, not because of the vehicle itself, but because she recognized the calm patience of the man behind the wheel. Lucas stepped out holding a dark umbrella before the valet could reach him. He crossed the sidewalk with the same quiet confidence she remembered from the very first evening they met. Nothing about him demanded attention, yet people naturally made room as he passed. Melissa glanced between them with an amused smile. "I suddenly remember an appointment I definitely have somewhere else." She disappeared into the lobby before Grace could protest. Luca stopped a few feet away. "Good evening," Grace smiled. "You still drive yourself sometimes, only when I hope the destination matters." The rain fell gently around them while city lights reflected across the wet pavement. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They no longer needed hurried explanations or unfinished questions. Silence had become comfortable between them. Luca reached into his coat pocket and handed Grace a small envelope. The final community report was completed this morning. She opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph of the restored neighborhood they had visited together months earlier. Trees lined clean sidewalks. Children played in the same park where they had once planted the first tree together. Families gathered beneath colorful banners celebrating the neighborhood's annual harvest festival. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten note, "Because one unexpected choice gave many others a chance to grow." Grace traced the words gently with her fingertips before looking back up. "You still remember every detail," Lucas smiled. "Some moments deserve remembering." They began walking slowly toward Bryant Park as the rain softened into a light mist. The familiar skyline glowed around them, brighter than either of them remembered from that first uncertain night. Along the way they passed the community garden that now overflowed with autumn flowers. Volunteers laughed while harvesting vegetables for local food banks. Children carefully watered young maple trees whose leaves had already begun turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Grace paused beside the largest tree in the garden. A small bronze plaque rested at its base. It read, "Dedicate unexpected kindness and the futures it quietly creates." She looked toward Luca with unmistakable warmth in her eyes. "Did you arrange this?" He shook his head. "The neighborhood council did. They said every project needs a story people can believe in." Grace smiled as memories returned with surprising clarity. A broken rideshare application, a rainy sidewalk, a simple mistake, a stranger who chose to stop instead of continuing on his way. She realized that none of those moments had been extraordinary on their own. Together they had become the turning point neither of them could have planned. As evening settled across New York, they reached the edge of the park where people hurried beneath umbrellas while musicians performed beneath glowing streetlights. The city sounded exactly as it always had, busy, hopeful, alive. Luca looked toward Grace. "If that night happened again, would you still wave at the wrong vehicle?" She laughed, the sound light enough to blend with the rain itself. "Knowing everything I know now, yes." She met his eyes without hesitation. "I do not think it was the wrong vehicle." Luca smiled, and this time the smile reached his eyes completely. They continued walking side by side through the gentle rain, not because destiny demanded it, but because both of them freely chose the same direction. Behind them, headlights reflected across the wet street exactly as they had 1 year earlier. Ahead of them, the city stretched into the distance, no longer filled with unanswered mysteries, but with ordinary days waiting to become extraordinary through simple acts of kindness, quiet courage, and the willingness to stop for someone who believed they were only asking for a ride home. The rain that had once introduced two strangers now simply accompanied two people walking toward the future together. And in that quiet reflection, the story found its perfect ending, proving that sometimes the greatest changes begin not with certainty, but with one small mistake that gently leads two lives exactly where they were always meant to be.